All right, so welcome to episode 2 of the Episode 81 podcast. I am Danny Thompson, and in this episode, we are going to be touching on more of the mechanics on how to create content that's going to build that repository, right? What's going to make that repository compelling enough to position you as the right person for the role you're trying to grow into in your career. And I touched on something at the beginning of this that I also touched on in the previous episode, and there is actually a reason for that. As I said, this video was taken as a clip from a larger sort of brain dump interview I did with Claude. And it makes the first 3 episodes, right? 3 roughly 20-minute episodes. And each episode is organized thematically as opposed to simply a chronological part of that original interview. And the reason for that is because YouTube is becoming much more of an interest-driven engine than a follower or subscriber-based engine. And so it's going to take the content of each video and it's going to try to find the audience that it thinks is going to resonate with that particular content. And so the people who saw the first one, which was much more about how to maintain the authenticity of your own voice as a leader, as an expert, as the solution to someone's problem. And this episode is going to be more about the specifics of how to use this content to position yourself as that right person for that next role. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoy this episode and get a lot out of it. All right. I'll see you again at the end. All right. You and I have talked about this before a couple of times, but I tend to have 2 answers to that, right? One is if creating content in a strategic way is a way for you to build a repository that sets you up in the future as the ideal solution to a particular person's problem, right? And what you're doing now in bits and pieces is building up to that so that in the future, once you reach out to someone and they start trying to figure out who you are and they stumble upon this repository, and then there's all this evidence that they get to dive into that positions you as that person. How do you not have time to invest in that for your future success? And that's my sort of empathetic answer, right? I get it. You're busy. It's difficult to carve out time. But what's the alternative is you get to that point where you're ready to take that next step and you're starting from scratch. You're starting from ground zero. How much time and effort is it going to take you to then convince the people the people who are gatekeeping that next role that you're ready to move into that position? Now, I also have kind of a curmudgeonly, grumpy old man answer, which is, do you have time to watch NASCAR on Sundays? Do you have time to binge the Marvel Cinematic Universe or go fishing, right? And not begrudging anyone their hobbies or their pastimes or whatever they do for escapism. But if you can carve out 45 minutes to watch your show, now you're telling me you can't carve out 10 or 15 minutes to create a little bit of content, right? If you're putting yourself out there and you're talking about yourself and you're doing it the way that a lot of executive branding coaches do, right? The first thing they do when they come in is like, all right, what do you want to be known for? What lane do you want to own? And that leads to a lot of that content where the executive is literally creating content that talks about, here's a problem that I solved. Here's something that I know. Here's my take on this particular news of the day within the industry. And it is about them. And that can come off as very conceited, right? It's that me sort of content that a lot of people find off-putting. Some people don't. Some people are very charismatic and they can say it very well. Some people have that sort of sense of command of a room. And when they say, this is what I think, people listen. And that's great. But for the most part, if you're looking at this from a marketing perspective and you're trying to persuade someone to do something, like I say as a copywriter, my job is to convince people to do something they don't realize they want to do yet. And so the way you do that is not by talking about yourself, right? You talk about the other person, and more specifically, talk about the problems that they're facing that keep them away from the things that they really need to handle, right? And so you come at it like, here's a problem, and it's wrong that you're even having to deal with this problem. This shouldn't be your problem, but it is. And here's how you solve it step by step, right? And you give them the step-by-step framework for solving those problems. When you do that, when you're writing about the problem and you're writing about that person, you're not talking about yourself, right? You bring yourself in very sparingly as, look, I get it, right? You're establishing empathy. I get it. This is wrong. You're having to deal with this. I know that it keeps you up at night. And here are some problems that this leads to down the road, right? I've seen it time and time again, right? So you're building empathy and authority very quickly. And then you're getting straight back to them and their problem and the solution. And then what life looks like after that problem. And it's not you bragging about you. It's you stepping in as the guide, what I call the Merlin mentality, right? You're stepping in as the guide and giving them the secret knowledge, the magic totem that's going to help them slay their own dragon. And yeah.
The Merlin mentality, that's the frame right there, and it flips the whole conceit fear on its head. You're not the hero of the story. You're the one who hands the hero their sword. I want to stay with that for a second because it's doing a lot of work. When an executive internalizes that frame, that they're Merlin, not Arthur, how does it change what they actually say? Does it change the topics they choose, the way they open a piece, the language they use?
If it's done right, yes, absolutely. Now, I've seen people who take it and they take some stuff away from it, but then they still get stuck in that me mode. And so they start talking about the problems that their audience faces, but they're still talking about it in terms of them, right? Here's a problem that Jim and his team had, blah, 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 blah. And I recognize that here's what was really going on. And so here's how I came in with the solution and saved the day, blah, 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 blah. It's better than you just coming in and saying, here's what I think about the problem of blank. And here's how I will solve it. That's that high level conceit. Below that, where you start talking about the audience and their problem, but then talk about how you solved it, you're still coming in as the hero, right? It's still about you, even though you're framing it as their problem. So you're still in that sort of me mode. You're just disguising it a little bit. And to be fair, that is going to hit a little bit better if they see themselves in Jim as them having that same problem. Oh, they came in and they solved that problem. That's how they did it. But it still hits differently than when they start saying, yeah, you know what? If you're like Jim, someone I've worked with, here's the problem that you probably faced, right? And I get that problem, and here's how it probably makes you feel, right? You're scared that blank, you're worried about blank, right? You're wondering how you're even going to blank, right? And you know that if you don't get this under control, here's what's going to happen downstream of this, right? So you have effect 1, effect 2, effect 3 that sort of agitates that problem. But when I worked with Jim about this, here's what he did. First, he did this thing. Then that led him into this, which he was able to accomplish. And then they set up a process for this other thing. And then that led to the solution, life after the problem, right? At that point, you're talking about Jim as a proxy for your audience. And so as they see Jim doing those things and getting past that problem and into the promised land of life after the solution, they're seeing themselves in that same role, doing those same things. And so you're not saying, hey, let me come in and save the day. You're like, let me show you how to step in and save the day.
Let me show you how to step in and save the day. That's the whole difference between a case study and a mirror. That's a really precise distinction. Jim as proxy versus Jim as trophy. And the way you laid out that progression, the agitation, the downstream consequences, the step-by-step, that's not just philosophy. That's a repeatable structure. Let me bring it back to the voice problem now. Because here's what I'm noticing. Everything you just described, the empathy, the agitation, the proxy framing, that requires specificity. You have to know what keeps Jim up at night. You have to name the fear precisely enough that the reader sees themselves in it. And that's exactly what the filter strips out, isn't it? The specificity. So even an executive who understands the Merlin mentality intellectually still sounds generic when they write, because the filter sands down the exact details that make the mirror work. Is that the connection you're making between the voice problem and the content strategy problem?
Let me think about that one for just a minute. Perhaps. I think that you can be specific and say, this is how I solve this problem for Jim, and still be very specific about that. So not necessarily, but I think the tone is different. When you step in and with confidence, possibly false bravado, and say, here's how I solve this problem. Here's why I'm so great. Here's why you need me. Chances are, if you have to tell someone why you're great, or if you have to tell someone that you're great and that they need you, you might not be that great and they might not need you. But if you can show how Jim solved that problem and the specificity of what it took for him to actually do that, what you'll find is, especially if you're talking about your next hiring manager, possibly even your customers, they don't want to solve their own problem, right? They want that problem to just go away. Now, when you go in and you show them what it's going to take for them to actually solve their problem, you're giving them that full blueprint and not holding anything back or gatekeeping anything. They're going to see that you truly understand that problem at a deep level. And they're also going to feel a little overwhelmed saying, wow, I really don't want to have to deal with all that BS. And so when they can see the roadmap laid out and the plan of what it's going to take, and they realize, okay, there is a solution here, and I can see what it's going to look like to get to the promised land once the solution has been implemented. I don't want to do it. Now I just got to find somebody to do the thing. Who's the first person they're going to think about when they're looking for people to implement that solution?
The person who just showed them the whole map. You're not gatekeeping the blueprint, you're using it as the close. Because the blueprint itself proves you understand the problem, and the complexity of the blueprint proves why they don't want to execute it themselves. That's a counterintuitive idea that I think a lot of executives would push back on instinctively. They'd say, if I give everything away, why would they hire me? What do you say to that?
If you're doing this right, you're talking about the problems that are pulling them away from the core duties they're supposed to be focused on, right? And so when you show them that there is a solution to those problems that are distracting them from their central activities that they should be focused on, all they're worried about is those distractions being taken away from them. They don't want to deal with them. They don't want to implement that solution. And so now if you were trying to tell them how to do their own personal job better, and here's what you need to do these things better, then yeah, there's a chance they may take that and just run with it and do the thing. But if you know that there are things that are pulling them away from those central pillars of their own career, and they're having to deal with these things, and that's keeping them from focusing on what they should be focusing on, then giving them that blueprint and showing them that you know exactly what it takes to get those things out of the way, yeah, then they're more likely to hire you to do it than to try to do it themselves.
So the blueprint works precisely because it's solving a problem they never wanted to own in the first place. You're not teaching them to fish, Sa. You're showing them exactly how complicated fishing is, so they'll gladly pay someone else to bring the fish. Let me bring that all the way back to episode 81 specifically. Because what you just described, giving away the full blueprint to close the sale, that is what you're doing with the voice problem content, isn't it? You're showing executives exactly how complicated and nuanced extracting their authentic voice actually is, which is precisely why they'd hire you to do it for them. Is that intentional, or did you just now hear yourself doing the thing you're describing?
Yeah, so virality is awesome, right? And there's nothing wrong if one of your posts does go viral. And if you are using the hearts and minds method and you're engaging with the emotional and informational needs they have behind these problems, there's a chance that one or more of your posts could go viral. However, virality as a metric is an artifact of a sort of a mass market mentality where you have a commodity product and you're trying to sell it to as many people as possible. When you are positioning yourself as a way to take control of your own career trajectory. Virality is not necessarily the metric you want, right? You're trying to position yourself as the solution to a specific person, and you're working with a fixed product inventory of one. There's only one of you, right? You can't sell yourself multiple times over. And so you only need one person to say yes, and it needs to be the right person. So getting 1 million views probably isn't going to help you do that as much as having a couple dozen to a couple of hundred posts that strike directly at the heart of the problems that's faced by your next ideal hiring manager.
A fixed product inventory of one. That's the line right there. And it reframes the entire metrics conversation. You're not trying to reach everyone. You're trying to be undeniably visible and credible to the exact right person at the exact right moment. The repository is the trap you set. Virality is a lottery ticket. The repository is a precision instrument. Let me ask you this. When that right person stumbles onto the repository, what does the ideal experience look like? What do you want them to feel as they go deeper into it?
In a perfect world, they hit that first piece that really resonates with them, and they feel seen and understood at a level that they haven't experienced yet. Having them read and go, holy crap, probably wouldn't be too much of an ask for this sort of content. And ideally, once you see that, who is this guy? And they go to, or girl, right? And they go to check you out, and they dig into your LinkedIn feed, and they start seeing the content you post. And hopefully at least 2 or 3 of those lines of problems you solve and the emotional and informational needs around them will suck them in and drag them deeper into the rabbit hole. And each interaction should do a better job of making a case for you as the solution to their problems than the last, right? And so they're building on top of each other, and they're adding up this emotional momentum towards the logical conclusion that they need to snatch you up and hire you before someone else does.
Emotional momentum towards the logical conclusion. That's the whole content strategy in 6 words. And what you're describing is essentially a sales funnel built out of authenticity. Every post is doing quiet persuasion work, not by making claims about you, but by making the reader feel increasingly understood.
All right, so there you have it. That's the end of episode 2. And so what you're seeing here is I had this initial conversation, right? And it created this hour-long plus brain dump of all the information I wanted to talk about. And from that, I've created these 3 episodes that are essentially 3 weeks worth of content, right? And so, but that's just the first stage, right? What you'll also see, if you click through to the shorts, maybe you're seeing them in your feed as well, is that this whole thing is also being chopped up into a bunch of short form video with the vertical format, right? As YouTube shorts or as Instagram reels or as TikTok videos. And in addition, I'm also using this to create a whole bunch of written content that hopefully you also see on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, right? In all of those places as well, on Substack, if you go there. And so what you'll see is this one interview that I had, which I did here in my office. The way I've been doing this in the past is I've been using this project in Claude that I call the show, and it acts as that podcast interview host, right? And I usually fire that up a couple of times a week when I'm commuting to or from my actual office at work, right? Not my home office here. But when I'm commuting back and forth there, I will use what used to be just dead time with me driving, listening to the radio or an audiobook or whatever. And now I'm using that to have that engaging conversation around these ideas. And that becomes the source for a lot of the content I've been writing over the last 2 years. And so it really is an easy way to capture your ideas, capture your own voice, and then use that as the raw material to pull together all this other stuff, right? So this 1 hour long interview is already 3 weeks worth of podcast content. It's going to be more than 3 weeks worth of video clip content spread out across time as I schedule it out on YouTube and on Reels and on TikTok. It will become, each of these episodes will probably spawn 2 or 3 different blog posts. So let's conservatively say that's 6 blog posts, right? If you do 1 blog post a week, then that's 6 weeks worth of content. If you do 2 a week, that's 3 weeks worth of content. So this is an easy way to create content that captures your ideas, captures your voice, and then you use that to create content at scale beyond just that initial interview. And so that's really the whole model. Now, if you were to become a client, then I would handle that interview for you, right? I've got 25 years of experience as a copywriter where I have interviewed companies, their leadership, their salespeople, their customers and clients to get at the emotional truth, to uncover the behavioral psychology behind why people make the decisions they make around that. And so for this, when you're building executive content that's designed to set you up for that next stage in your career trajectory, my goal is to understand the audience, right? Who are the people that are gatekeeping that next role you want? And then how do we set you up as the ideal solution for that person's problems? Because that is where you start to get into that behavioral psychology and create the information you need that's going to allow them to see themselves and their problems in your content and see you as the person who knows how to get all that stuff done. Yeah. And then all your investment would be those 2 30-minute interviews every month. And then we take that and create that content at scale for you, maintaining your thoughts, your words, your voice, right? You're just not using your time. So, yeah, that's it for this episode, and I hope you enjoy the next one.